place? It was late, right. The disciples said, Jesus, it's getting late. We better dismiss the crowd because they haven't had anything to eat all day, and it's getting dusk. So it's getting, darkness is coming soon. So Jesus dismisses the crowd. He sends his disciples down on the boat. What does he do? He goes up on the mountainside, and for two reasons. Number one, the people are trying to make him a king, and he's not leading a political revolt, so he's got to get out of there. And number two, he goes up. Now, John doesn't say this, but Matthew and Mark both report this. He goes up to pray. He needs a spiritual retreat. He needs some time away. It's been exhausting. He needs some time with his Father. All right? So that's where we're going to pick up. So let's just read this together. Oh, perfect. So let's go back to the first one. All right. So, Sea of Galilee is in the north. That is the basis of Jesus' ministry, is up in the north. Sometimes we see, like in the Gospel of John, Jesus' interactions and events down in Jerusalem in the south. But Sea of Galilee in the north, it's kind of shaped like a heart. I think it's about 12, 14 miles long, 7 miles wide, so as wide as the Potomac River here. This is what it looks like close up. Now, they are on the eastern side, the desolate kind of side, and they got to go to Capernaum. So it's kind of across the, but it's in the northwest. All right, and as you're going to see in this story, they're going to be blown off course by a wind that's blowing from the west, and it's blowing them out in the middle of the lake. It's blowing them off course. Okay, it's kind of blowing them maybe to the south, to the west or southwest. All right, so let's go ahead and read John chapter 6, verse 16. They're a pretty simple passage. And we'll look at Matthew's version too, because Matthew was one of the disciples, and he wrote down an eyewitness account, and it's slightly different. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, that's verse 16, where they got into the boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. There you have it. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. Now that's the main focus of today, but let me keep reading a couple more verses. The next day, the crowd that had stayed on the opposite shore of the lake realized that only one boat had been there, and that Jesus had not entered it with his disciples, but that he was gone away. Then some boats from Tiberias landed near the place where the people had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks. Once the crowd realized that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they got into the boats. They went to Capernaum in search of Jesus. So there we have the passage for today. Now, I've already showed you the map. Do you remember 2 weeks ago when I described... let's go to the next picture. Okay, there's a... All right, now that's what the Sea of Galilee looks like, facing east. So they're over here on the hills, looking out on the water. Jesus is kind of preaching. But you know what happens? I don't understand in detail, but as a hunter, I know that you've got to be very careful of your scent because as it cools down in the evening, you will warm air rises and cold air falls. So I don't know if that's the issue here, but since the Sea of Galilee is into depression, somehow the wind began to kick up. As the wind's coming over those mountains, or as the temperatures are maybe decreasing in the evening, the wind begins to kick up and it stirs up somewhat of either large waves, or I don't think it was a storm in this particular case, but significant wind and significant waves. Now, both Matthew and John say they were about halfway out in the lake. All right? And it says that they were rowing pretty much all night. Now, Matthew's version says in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went out on the lake to meet them. And in Roman times, from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. was the first watch. 9 to midnight was the second watch. Midnight to 3 was the third. And the fourth watch was from 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. So sometime between the period of 3 a.m. and 6 a.m., Jesus is walking out to meet the disciples. Which basically, if they started rowing at 7 p.m. and it's now 4, I mean, we're talking like 9. They've been rowing for 9 hours. Or a significant portion. So at the very least, they are probably very irritated. And exhausted and tired and just drained. All right? And I want you to picture this. They're probably rowing with their back against the wind, okay? Because they're rowing into the wind, so their back is probably against the wind. So they're looking at the shore that they left. Now, can you imagine in the darkness, you see some figure, and the figure is gaining on you. You're rowing, and this figure is coming closer and closer and closer. Sorry. She's trying to keep me on video, and I'm... All right, sorry. All right, I stayed stationary. So, they're rowing, and this figure is coming out of the mist, and it's coming closer and closer against the wind. And what do they think it is? A ghost, right? And they are totally afraid. Now, here's what's so funny. Turn to Mark chapter 6, verse 48. Just keep your hand at John 6, but turn. Can somebody read Mark 6:48? Because it's a really funny verse. If you get there fast enough, do you want to read it? Mark 6:48.
He saw that they were in serious trouble, rowing hard and struggling against the wind's waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, he came to them walking on the water. He started to go past them. But when they saw him walking on the water, they screamed in terror, thinking he was a ghost.
Thank you. Sorry about the distraction. Thanks, Tirza. All right, so here's what Mark says. Did you guys catch it? It's really funny. All right, so he's rowing. They're rowing. They're exhausted. Here's this figure coming out of the darkness. It's Jesus. At first they think it's a ghost because they can't see him very clear because you know your eyes when light is bad. And Mark says, and Jesus intended to what? Pass. Hey guys. And he just keeps walking. It's like, but I don't know. But okay, so I always thought that was funny. And then we'll mention, once Jesus gets into the boat immediately hits ground at their location where they want to go. So that's significant. I'll mention that in a second. Because they're in the middle of the lake. I mean, they've been rowing for 9 hours, and then all of a sudden, the moment Jesus gets in the boat, they run up on the shore. That's pretty miraculous. And I'll mention in a moment. So let's turn to Matthew chapter 14, because Matthew gets into something. All of you guys are familiar with this. It's a great miracle. We're so proud of Peter. But Matthew reports something that John just doesn't get into here in this. This is same story, same circumstances. Matthew chapter 14, starting in verse 25, it says, Matthew 14:25. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When his disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. They said, "It's a ghost." They cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." And Peter says, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." And Jesus says, "Come." Right? It's a really famous passage. So then Jesus got out of the boat. He walked on water. He came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he became afraid because he took his eyes off Jesus. Right? And what happened to him? He began to sink. He cries out, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus reaches out, grabs his hand, catches him, and he says, "You have little faith. Why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind had died down. So the wind dies down when Jesus gets in the boat. And those who were with him in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." And I'm going to get to that in a moment. All right, so here's what I'm just thinking really quick for the boat. I'm thinking in my life, what is your water? Like, has anybody ever read, Peggy, have you ever read, what is that? If you want to walk on water, you've got to get out of the boat. Okay, but it makes sense. If you want to walk on water, you've got to get out of the boat. What is your water and what is your boat? So boat, I'm thinking for us would be something that's comfortable, secure. Like, why would I? And water would be something that would cause us to take a step of faith. We'd have to confront fear. It's risky. Where is God calling you or I to take a risk in faith? To not doubt, to not give in to fear, maybe to step out of your life of comfort or security, and to take that risk with no doubt. And then what would prevent us from stepping out? I think sometimes, sure, comfort, security, a fear of failure. Have you ever thought about fear of failure? A fear of loss. Maybe losing something valuable to you or loss of control. I think Chosen did a great job of illustrating Nicodemus. Do you remember Nicodemus, for those of you guys who saw The Chosen? Remember that one time when Jesus invited him? He's like, Nicodemus, step out of the boat, come follow me. And do you remember that scene where Nicodemus was hiding behind the wall? And he had left a pouch of gold, I think, on the well. And he's like peering, you could kind of, the disciples are just on the other side. And Jesus is standing there waiting just for a couple seconds, looking, anticipating Nicodemus to come, but he doesn't come. And I think immediately in his mind, you know what? He's being pulled, the life I've always known. My wife, she wants me to go back to Jerusalem. My ministry, I'm one of the Pharisees. And yet, here's this opportunity to basically let go of all of that, to step out of the boat and to do something, to overcome my fears and to do something in faith. Sure, I would agree with you. Sorry, we've got so much interaction today. Caleb's acting up, isn't he? He's got to learn to wait patiently to be fed. All right. And then, another one is, think about this for a moment, the young rich man. Do you remember the story of the young rich man? He actually lives at the time in human history, at the right place, at the right time to meet God in human flesh. And you know what God says? Or Jesus says, sell everything you have, come follow me, and you'll have treasure in heaven. And what does the young rich man do? He just walks away. Here's a thought that never crossed my mind up to this point, but it adds so much depth. Do you think later on in life, at the age of 85, do you think he looked around at his beautiful home and all his wealth and possessions and said, if I only had another chance to go back and do it all again, all of this stuff is worthless. It's absolutely worthless. Why did I do that? Do you think he had a regret of saying, because when you get to the end of your life, you realize that your material possessions don't really matter as much as you thought they did when you were younger. And I can't help but wonder if the other 11 disciples who were in the boat ever looked back on that opportunity and said, I regret not stepping out in faith with Peter. Because that was a memorable opportunity that Peter would have never forgot. And I don't think the disciples would have ever forgot it too. Have you ever now it's bad to wrestle too much with regrets. I want to live my life with no regrets. None at all. I want to be able to stand before Jesus and say, I did everything that I could with no regrets, but inevitably all of us have regrets looking back, But I guess the appeal to you this morning is if we don't step out of the boat, you are guaranteed to fail. You're guaranteed failure. Because even though it looks safe, if we're not going to Jesus, if we're not stepping out in faith to what Jesus wants us to do, His ministry, His will for our lives, we're taking the safe, comfortable, but in the end, it's going to cost us. But if you step out, what happened to Peter? He stepped out, he was walking, but then he began to sink. So a lot of times the fear of stepping out of the boat is failure. But failure really is only potentially temporary, and most of the things, I'll tell you one of the most embarrassing things that drives me absolutely insane to this day. I can't even think about it. Oh, it frustrates me so much. The first wedding I ever performed, somebody very close to me said, ask them if they want me to introduce them and have their first kiss at the end of the ceremony or when they first walk in the reception. So you know what I did? I asked them, and I think it was confusing. And at the end of the wedding, they didn't do a kiss in front of everybody. And it messed it up. It messed it up. And I felt I'm still to this day, I can't, why did I listen to this person over here? And why did I even ask this silly question? And I don't think they knew what they were, because I'm in charge of the service. And it was just, I will never forget that. And I will never make that mistake again, because everybody was anticipating, kiss, your first kiss. I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride. And anyway, that's just one of my failures. And I'll never forget it. And I'll never make the same mistake again. And they were very gracious and everything's fine. But so even when we step out of the boat, sometimes we still may experience a temporary, we're going to have opposition. It's going to be difficult, but it's worth it. And once Peter stepped out, in my mind too, when we do something in faith, if we're not careful with our eyes, we can focus on things that either remove hope or provide hope. Either it diminishes our hope or it feeds our hope. So keeping our eyes on Jesus feeds hope, right? But in Peter's case, when I keep my eyes on the problem, what usually happens? Or you lose hope. Your hope diminishes. Right. When you keep your eyes on Jesus and you renew yourself in Jesus, your hope is restored. So let me see if I can summarize this, because this is a pretty simple message for today. Number one, in this particular passage, we see, 2 weeks ago and this story, we see that Jesus is all-powerful and he is over all material, like the bread and the fish, He's over all matter, and he's also over all nature. This miracle of he's walking on the water. He's calming the wind. So Jesus is all powerful, and Jesus is in total control. I don't know if you picked this up from when Melody read Mark chapter 6, verse 48, but it said, Mark actually said, when Jesus saw them struggling at the oars. You know what I pictured? Jesus is still up on this mountain. It's pitch dark at night. The disciples are 3.5 miles out in the water. And Jesus supernaturally knew exactly where they were at, exactly what was happening. He saw them, even in the midst of the darkness. So, not only is Jesus all-powerful over matter and over all nature, but he's in total control. He knows exactly, intimately, where we're at in life. He's aware of our situation. And the moment that Jesus stepped in the boat, instantaneously, immediately, the boat hit the shore. So Jesus has the power to solve your problem like that, right? And he did in the disciples' circumstances. So I think what Jesus maybe, I'm hoping that somehow in your life, I would say for me, one of the big issues for me was probably Army Reserve chaplaincy. Because that's kind of stepping out of the boat in the sense of out of your comfort zone, out of your security. I went yesterday just for a couple hours until lunch to interact with and to meet people. And I'm talking, I only understood 20% of all communication that took place. I didn't understand any of the acronyms. I didn't understand anything. I'm like, this is in completely different language. And it was so overwhelming. And it was like, oh my gosh, what have I gotten myself into? This is not good. This is like, And because I was so focused on like the military terminology, I've been so far and I have to learn a whole new language. And there's a lot of things that would push me out of my comfort zone in terms of administrative tasks and stuff like that. It was a good time, and I connected with Chaplain Schneider really well, and we had some great prayer time and connections with other soldiers and stuff. But that's just an area in my life where I feel like the Lord is encouraging me to step out of the boat in faith. Don't be afraid and trust Him. Keep your eyes on Jesus in the midst of the potential turmoil. Where is that in your life? What is He calling you to? What is one risk that Jesus is calling you to in this season of your life to help your faith grow? Something beyond human power. And I feel like Jesus, just like He said to Peter, He's like, come. Like His hand is extended as an invitation, and He wants us to step out to experience more of Him, to draw closer, and to basically live by adventurous faith. How is He challenging you to do that in this season of your life? All right? To be like a Peter, to live with no regrets. So, ultimately, my last statement here, and we're going to close with a song, is right now I have a knowledge that Jesus is able to do anything. But you know what the disciples had that was one up on me? What was the last thing the disciples did in this story? Scott, did you catch that when I was reading in Matthew? What was the reaction of the disciples? Did anybody catch that? Huh? To a greater degree, sure. It built their faith. Somebody said it, I thought. Worshipped. Yeah, they worshipped. That was the end result. It always comes back to worship of God. So ultimately, I don't want just an intellectual understanding that Jesus is capable. What led to worship in the disciples' lives was truly experiencing Jesus do something beyond human power. So I think we should worship Jesus based on the truth that we have, of course, And but also worship seems to bubble up more freely when we see Jesus arrive on the scene and do something that only He can do. Yes.
But I feel like He arrives on the scene all the time and we don't see Him because we're too focused on the problem.
That's a very good point.
And if something happened to me this week and I was worried, and I was worried about something that I had absolutely no control over, and I was worried more than I even realized until the worry went away. And God put me someplace I never would have expected to be, put someone else where normally they wouldn't have been, interacted with these people, they walked away, and something inside me said, ask. And so I called the person back and asked the question. The question has been driving me crazy and was causing me worry that I didn't even realize how much. And I thought they would know. It's their skill set. And I had to holler a couple of times because they were that far away. And she came back and I asked, and she answered my question in a heartbeat and then said, but if it'll make you feel better, I'll look over everything and make sure that, what I'm telling you is true and see if there's anything I can do to help. And in that instant, I felt a relief and realized how much I had been worrying about it. But then once I stopped worrying, I saw how God put me where I wouldn't have been. God put them where they shouldn't have been. And God put it all together and got me the answer that I needed and got me the help that I needed to resolve the issue without me doing anything except asking. But I was so focused on the other solution that I thought that was going to be the answer that it never even occurred to me to ask that person who was right there and available and would have been glad to answer my question if I'd have just asked. But God worked it out so that I would bump into that person at that time so that I could ask. And there were 12 other little dumb things that happened. But I was so focused on the problem. Number one, I didn't even realize how worried I was. Number two, I never asked God to work it out for me. I never said, God, would you please Just help me stop worrying about this. Just please work this out for me. But he did it anyway.
So technically, that's like Peter looking at the wind and the waves and not even realizing that Jesus is already touching his hand, sort of, and is already pulling him up out of. So we can become so consumed with focusing on the problem that we don't see that Jesus is in fact already working, in our midst. So I think that's a really good point. Well, let's close out with one song, "In the Eye of the Storm," and then I'll pray and we'll close out service with this. So let's rise if you're able again.